The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the trees with relentless fury. Rain pounded against the wooden walls of the remote dog rescue shelter, a place nestled deep in the wilderness, far from the chaos of the city. Thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the very ground beneath. The sky, a vast expanse of swirling black clouds, crackled with streaks of lightning, momentarily illuminating the desolate landscape. Inside the modest cabin, Jack Reynolds sat at his worn wooden desk, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. The dim glow of the lamp barely reached the corners of the room, casting long shadows that flickered against the walls. His rugged hands traced absent-mindedly over the deep grooves in the wood, a habit he had picked up over the years, a way to keep himself grounded. His face, carved by time and hardship, bore the marks of a past he had tried to leave behind. The faint scars along his jaw and temple were reminders of battles fought in places no one would ever know. He exhaled deeply, staring at the storm raging outside. It was nights like these that reminded him of who he used to be, a ghost from another life, a man with blood on his hands, a former operative whose existence had once been defined by violence. Now he had chosen solitude, finding purpose in rescuing the discarded, the unwanted, dogs that had been abandoned, just as he had once been. Then Titan stirred. The large Pitbull, a massive beast of muscle and unwavering loyalty, had been dozing by the fireplace, his gray coat gleaming in the firelight. But suddenly, his ears perked up, his body stiffened. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his throat as he turned toward the window, his dark eyes locked on something beyond the glass. Jack frowned, setting down the book he hadn't really been reading. "What is it, boy?" he muttered, following Titan's gaze. A flash of lightning lit up the yard outside, revealing only the drenched ground and the trees swaying violently under the storm's wrath. Jack saw nothing out of the ordinary, but Titan's growling only grew more urgent, his body coiled with tension. He wasn't barking at the storm. Something was out there. Jack grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and rose from his chair. His bones ached more than they used to, remnants of old injuries that never quite healed. As he approached the door, Titan moved beside him, his stance rigid, protective. The moment Jack opened the door, the wind slammed into him like a freight train, sending icy rain pelting against his face. He shielded his eyes, gripping the flashlight tighter. Titan bolted ahead, his powerful body moving with purpose. The dog's instincts had never failed him before. Jack followed, boots sinking into the muddy ground as he swept the flashlight across the yard. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the chain-link kennels, the rows of sheltering structures, until it landed on something that sent a chill down his spine. At the far end of the property, just beyond the last kennel, something small huddled beneath the twisted roots of an old oak tree. Jack's pulse quickened. He moved closer, his breath turning to mist in the cold night air. Titan reached the figure first, circling it cautiously, sniffing the air with a low whine. Then, the flashlight's glow revealed the truth. A child. A little girl, no older than 10, was curled up on the wet earth, her small body trembling violently. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her fragile frame. Her dark hair was plastered to her pale skin, rain dripping from the strands. But what made Jack's breath catch in his throat wasn't just the fact that she was alone, drenched and freezing. It was the way her wrists were bound. Thick plastic zip ties cut into her delicate skin, digging deep into the flesh. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her knees, as if trying to make herself as small as possible. Jack knelt beside her, careful not to startle her. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. "It's okay. You're safe now." She didn't respond. Her large, frightened eyes, so impossibly wide, stared up at him, filled with something deeper than fear. Something shattered. Jack reached for a knife from his belt, cutting through the bindings with precise movements. The zip ties snapped apart, freeing her hands. She flinched slightly but didn't recoil from his touch. Instead, she slowly brought her hands to her chest, rubbing the raw marks on her wrists. "Can you talk?" Jack asked, scanning her for any other injuries. "Do you know your name?" Still, she said nothing. Titan, however, moved closer. The dog, usually wary of strangers, nudged her gently with his nose. The girl tensed at first, but then, hesitantly, reached out. Her small fingers brushed against Titan's damp fur, and for the first time since Jack had found her, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition. A moment of trust. And then he noticed something else. Hanging around her neck, gleaming under the flashlight's glow, was a delicate silver chain. At its center rested a small pendant, a star, intricately designed, shimmering despite the storm. Jack frowned. He had seen something like this before, not just anywhere, in classified files. His gut twisted. Whoever this girl was, she wasn't just lost. She was important, and someone had left her here to die. Jack's eyes flicked toward the tree line, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight. If she had been abandoned, then someone had made sure no one would find her. But what if they were still out there? Titan's ears perked up again, his gaze shifting toward the woods. Jack felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Something wasn't right. He needed to get her inside, fast. Scooping the girl into his arms, Jack turned back toward the house, Titan following close behind, still casting glances toward the unseen threats lurking in the night. As Jack carried her across the muddy ground, the same questions echoed in his mind. Who was she? Who had done this to her? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what were they willing to do to get her back? Jack pushed open the door to his cabin, stepping inside as the warmth from the crackling fireplace instantly fought against the icy chill clinging to his skin. The storm raged on outside, rain hammering against the roof in relentless waves. But inside, there was only silence, save for the occasional popping of burning wood and the deep breaths of Titan, who had refused to leave his side. The little girl in his arms remained motionless, her body stiff even as he set her gently on the worn leather chair near the fire. Her clothes were soaked through, and she shivered violently, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Jack knelt down, carefully slicing through the last remnants of the plastic zip ties that had bound her. As the restraints fell away, his jaw tightened at the sight of deep purple bruises marring her delicate wrists. Whoever had done this hadn't just abandoned her. They had wanted to keep her restrained, helpless. Jack exhaled slowly, reining in the anger simmering beneath his skin. This wasn't the time for speculation. First, he needed to get her warm. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from the couch and draped it over her small shoulders, watching as she instinctively pulled it tighter around herself. Still, she said nothing. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing sharp cheekbones that were just a little too sunken for a child her age. She was pale, whether from the cold or something else, Jack wasn't sure. But her eyes, they were wide, deep, and filled with something beyond fear. Titan, ever watchful, approached slowly. His movements were careful, calculated, as though he sensed the fragile state she was in. He sniffed at her, his large head tilting slightly as he studied the girl with an intensity that Jack had only seen a few times before, like the dog was making a decision of his own. Then, without hesitation, Titan lowered himself to the floor and lay at her feet. His body, normally coiled with muscle and tension, was relaxed, as if to reassure her. Jack watched, waiting. For a long moment, the girl remained motionless. But then, with hesitant fingers, she reached out, resting her small hand against Titan's fur. The Pitbull barely stirred, his breathing steady, as if he had already accepted his new role. Jack sat back on his heels. "He's got good instincts," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She didn't respond. She just kept staring at the fire, her fingers lightly gripping Titan's fur as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. Jack ran a hand over his face, rubbing the tension from his temples. He wasn't equipped for this. He had spent years avoiding people, shutting himself away from anything that required emotional investment. And now, a girl who wouldn't speak, who had been left out in the storm like discarded trash, was sitting in his home, guarded by the one creature in the world he trusted more than himself. He sighed and leaned forward. "Listen, kid," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I don't know who you are or what happened to you, but you're safe here. No one's gonna hurt you." Her fingers curled tighter around the blanket, but she still said nothing. Jack sat back, letting the silence settle. He had learned long ago that pushing too hard only made people retreat further. Instead, his eyes landed on something unusual. Beneath the tangled mess of her damp hair, just at the base of her neck, there was a faint mark. A thin, nearly invisible scar that ran horizontally across her skin. Jack frowned, leaning in slightly to get a better look. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Clean. Precise. A surgical scar. His stomach tightened. This wasn't the kind of injury a kid got from falling or playing too rough. This was deliberate. Jack sat back, his mind already running through possibilities. What kind of procedure had been done on a child this young, and why? His gaze drifted to the small silver necklace still hanging around her neck. The star-shaped pendant glowed faintly in the firelight, the only clue to her identity. Jack didn't believe in coincidences. He never had. Something was very, very wrong here. And he had a feeling that whoever had done this to her wasn't finished yet. The morning after the storm felt unnervingly still. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a damp chill that clung to the air. The muddy ground outside the cabin bore the scars of the previous night. Deep boot prints where Jack had walked, paw prints where Titan had followed, and one smaller set of footprints that belonged to the girl. She was still asleep on the couch, curled beneath the heavy blanket Jack had given her. Titan lay nearby, his massive head resting on his paws, but his ears twitched at the slightest noise. He hadn't left her side once. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, leaning against the kitchen counter as he stared out the window. The sky was still overcast, thick clouds rolling low over the treetops. It should have been a quiet morning, just another day in his self-imposed exile. But his instincts told him otherwise. Something wasn't right. Jack had spent too many years in the field, too many years watching his own back, to ignore the gnawing feeling that had settled in his gut. He moved to the small security monitor mounted on the wall, flipping through the surveillance feeds from the cameras he had installed around the property. Most of them showed nothing out of the ordinary, just rows of kennels, the storage shed, the dirt driveway leading up to the shelter. Then he saw it. A black SUV. It was parked just beyond the tree line, half hidden behind the brush. The engine was still running. Jack's grip tightened around the coffee mug as he studied the screen. The vehicle hadn't been there the night before. It had arrived sometime early in the morning, but whoever was inside hadn't made a move. He switched to another camera angle, zooming in. That's when he spotted the figure. A man stood near the edge of the property, just within view of the kennels. He was dressed in a dark coat, his hands tucked into his pockets, his face obscured by the angle of the camera. He wasn't approaching, wasn't trying to break in. He was just watching. Jack set his coffee down and reached for the handgun he kept in the top drawer of his desk. He checked the magazine, fully loaded. Years of instinct kicked in, his body moving without conscious thought. Titan lifted his head, sensing the shift in Jack's demeanor. The dog's ears perked, his muscles tensing. Jack knelt beside Titan, scratching him behind the ears. "Stay with her," he murmured, glancing toward the girl still asleep on the couch. Titan let out a quiet huff in response, but didn't move. Jack grabbed his jacket, slipping out the back door, moving low and silent as he made his way toward the tree line. The SUV hadn't moved. The man was still standing there. Jack stayed in the shadows, approaching from an angle that gave him the upper hand. He had spent years tracking people, studying their behavior. And this guy? He wasn't lost. He wasn't here by accident. He was waiting for something. Or someone. Jack was close enough now to hear the distant hum of the engine, the steady sound of the man's breath. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but not military. Something about the way he stood, too casual, too at ease, told Jack he wasn't a trained operative. But he was still a threat. Jack stepped out of the shadows, making his presence known. "Morning," he called, his voice steady, unreadable. The man barely flinched. He turned slightly, just enough for Jack to see his face. Mid-30s, short-cropped dark hair, sharp eyes that flicked over Jack like he was assessing a potential danger. Jack stopped a few feet away, arms loose at his sides, but his entire body was coiled, ready. "Something I can help you with?" The man offered a small, almost polite smile. "Nice place you've got here." Jack didn't respond. The man's gaze drifted past him, toward the shelter. "I heard you take in strays." Jack's jaw clenched. This wasn't random. The girl. They were looking for her. Jack kept his expression neutral. "That's so?" The man shrugged. "Storm was bad last night. Figured someone might have gotten lost out here." His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching Jack closely. Jack let a beat of silence stretch between them, then nodded toward the SUV. "You got a map in that thing?" The man smirked. "Something like that." Jack took half a step forward, just enough to make his point. "Then I'd suggest you use it." For a moment, the two men stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Jack could see the gears turning in the man's head, weighing his options, but he wasn't stupid. He knew when he was outmatched. Finally, the man gave a small, knowing nod and turned back toward the SUV. As he opened the door, he glanced over his shoulder. "You ever find something that doesn't belong to you?" he said, voice smooth, almost friendly. "Best to give it back." Jack didn't move as the SUV rumbled to life, reversing down the dirt road before disappearing into the trees. Only when the sound of the engine had faded completely did Jack allow himself to breathe. He turned back toward the cabin, his mind racing. They weren't trying to take her. Not yet. They were just watching, waiting. And that meant one thing. They weren't done looking. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls of the cabin. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, a lingering echo of the storm that had passed the night before. The little girl lay curled up on the couch, her small frame barely visible beneath the thick blanket Jack had given her. Titan lay nearby, his heavy breathing the only steady sound in the quiet room. The Pitbull had refused to leave her side, his protective instincts stronger than ever. Jack sat in his chair across from them, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, eyes watching the girl. Not with suspicion, but with concern. She hadn't spoken a word. Not since he'd found her. Not since the strange man in the SUV had appeared that morning. She ate when he gave her food, drank the hot tea he made, but she never spoke. He'd seen that kind of silence before, deep, all-consuming, the kind that came from trauma buried too deep to surface. Jack had dealt with broken people before. Hell, he had been one himself, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. A sudden, piercing scream shattered the silence. Jack nearly knocked over his coffee as the girl bolted upright on the couch, eyes wide, mouth open in a soundless cry before the scream fully escaped her lips. It was raw, panicked, an echo of pure terror that clawed at the air. Titan was up in an instant, his massive body positioned protectively in front of her, his ears flattened, eyes sharp. But he didn't growl. Instead, he whined low in his throat, sensing something deeper than immediate danger. Jack was beside her in seconds, but he didn't touch her. He knew better than to grab someone in the middle of a nightmare. Her breathing was ragged, chest rising and falling in frantic, uneven gasps. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. She stared straight ahead, but she wasn't seeing the cabin. She was seeing something else, something terrible. "Hey, kid," Jack said, voice steady, low. "You're safe. It's not real. Whatever you're seeing, it's not here." The girl's hands clawed at the blanket, fingers trembling. Her lips moved, forming words that didn't come. Then suddenly, "They killed her." Jack stilled. Her voice was hoarse, cracked from disuse, but the words were unmistakable. The girl gasped for air, clutching at her own arms as though trying to ground herself. Her wide, terrified eyes finally met his, and Jack saw something shift inside her, like a wall crumbling under the weight of something too heavy to bear alone. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "They killed my mom." Jack's stomach tightened. He didn't say anything. He just let her speak. The words came in broken fragments, like shattered glass trying to be pieced back together. "They took me," she whispered, voice barely audible. They put something in me. A needle." Her fingers brushed the back of her neck unconsciously, right where Jack had seen the faint scar. "I don't know what it was, but it burned. I couldn't move." Jack exchanged a glance with Titan, the Pitbull still watching her with unwavering focus. She took a shaky breath. "I heard them talking about how I was the last one. I don't know what that means." "The last one?" Jack leaned forward slightly, careful not to push too hard. "Who were they?" She shook her head, squeezing her eyes shut as if trying to push the memory away. "I don't know. They wore masks, but one of them, his voice, he was in charge. He said I was too important to be lost." A cold chill ran down Jack's spine. Too important to be lost. The words didn't sit right. They weren't the words of someone who saw her as just another child. Jack's fingers unconsciously flexed, a habit from years of gripping weapons, of preparing for the worst. "And your mom?" he asked gently. The girl's breath hitched, and for a moment Jack thought she might shut down again, but then she whispered, "She got me out." Jack waited. "She came for me," she continued, voice trembling. "She told me to run. She said—" The girl broke off, squeezing her hands into fists. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "She said, 'You're the last hope. Don't let them take you again.'" Jack exhaled slowly, a mother's last words, a desperate plea, and then the final blow. "She stayed behind." The girl's voice cracked. "She didn't run." Her hands gripped the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. "They shot her." Silence. Jack let it settle, let the weight of it anchor in the space between them. The girl was shaking, her body still racked with aftershocks of the nightmare she'd relived. Titan moved first, pressing his heavy head against her arm. She tensed at first. Then, slowly, her fingers curled into his fur, holding on to him like an anchor. Jack sat back, running a hand over his face. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This wasn't just a runaway kid. Someone had killed her mother to keep her from escaping. Someone had experimented on her. And someone, whoever was in that SUV, wanted her back. Jack knew, deep down, that he should walk away from this, that he should find someone who could take her far, far away from whatever nightmare she had come from. But as he watched the way Titan stayed close to her, as he saw the way she clung to the Pitbull like he was the only solid thing left in her world, Jack realized something. She wasn't just a lost kid. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. And whoever had tried to take her life away wasn't going to stop. Jack leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. "You don't have to remember everything right now," he said. "But I need you to tell me one thing." The girl looked up at him, eyes still full of fear. Jack met her gaze, steady and unshaken. "Do you want to fight back?" The silence stretched for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he found her, something shifted in her expression, a flicker of something raw and real. She nodded. Jack nodded back. "Good," he said, "because I'm not letting them take you again." And with that, the decision was made. He wasn't just going to protect her, he was going to make sure they never found her again. Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee in his hands. His mind was racing, turning over everything the girl had told him. Every detail, every fractured memory, every whispered word about masked men, needles, and a mother who had given her life to help her escape. She wasn't just a lost kid, she was a target. The girl, who still hadn't told him her name, was asleep again, curled up under a thick blanket on the couch. Titan lay stretched out on the floor beside her, his large frame positioned between her and the door, as if he knew danger could come at any moment. Jack knew that feeling all too well. The man in the SUV had been looking for something. Now Jack was starting to put the pieces together. He turned on his laptop, fingers moving with the efficiency of someone who had spent years digging through classified files. His past life as an operative might have been behind him, but old habits died hard. Nova. The name sent a chill through him as soon as he typed it into the search bar. He had heard of them before, a biotech conglomerate, one of the largest in the country. Publicly, they developed cutting-edge medical treatments, gene therapies, and pharmaceuticals. But Jack knew better than to believe the glossy PR. Companies like Nova didn't get to the top without leaving a trail of buried secrets behind them. And now, this girl, this child, was somehow connected to them. Jack scrolled through article after article, searching for anything that stood out. And then he found it. A news piece from 2 years ago. A scientist and his wife, both former Nova researchers, had died in what authorities ruled as a car accident. The article barely made headlines, buried beneath bigger news. But Jack knew a cover-up when he saw one. The couple had been working on an advanced genetic modification project, something shrouded in secrecy, and then suddenly they were gone. Jack's jaw clenched as realization settled in. The girl on his couch, she was their daughter, and Nova hadn't just wanted her dead, they had wanted her back. He shut the laptop and ran a hand over his face. This wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about silencing anyone who could expose them. They had experimented on children. Jack looked toward the girl, his eyes drawn to the faint scar on the back of her neck. Whatever they had done to her, it hadn't just been about taking her parents away. It had been about using her. And now, she was the last one left. A soft sound broke his thoughts. He turned to see the girl shifting on the couch, her fingers curling into the blanket as her eyes fluttered open. She blinked sleepily before her gaze landed on him. Jack hesitated for a moment, then set his coffee down. "How long were you in that place?" he asked, keeping his voice even. She sat up slowly, her small frame still looking fragile despite the firelight casting a warm glow over her face. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't remember everything. Sometimes, it feels like I was there forever." Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They were experimenting on you?" It wasn't a question. The girl swallowed hard and nodded. "They said I was different." Jack exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "Different how?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "I don't know. They didn't tell me things. They just took me to rooms, hooked me up to machines. Sometimes I woke up with bandages. They said I was special, but—" She stopped, biting her lip. "I think they were lying." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. Of course they were lying, and her parents had found out. That's why they were dead. Jack took a slow breath, trying to control the anger simmering beneath his skin. He had seen things in his life, dark, ugly things that most people couldn't even imagine. but nothing turned his stomach like the idea of a child being used like this. The girl looked at him carefully. "You believe me?" Jack met her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "I believe you." Something in her posture changed, just slightly, like she was bracing herself for the moment when he would tell her she was crazy, when he wouldn't believe her like so many others probably hadn't. Jack ran a hand through his hair. He had spent the last few years of his life trying to stay out of trouble, trying to live in peace. But peace had just been ripped away from him, because now, Nova wasn't just an abstract name in the background. They were real. They had been on his land, and they weren't going to stop until they had this girl back. Jack stood, grabbing his jacket off the chair. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk more in the morning." The girl hesitated before nodding, but just as he turned away, her voice stopped him. "My name's Evelyn," she said quietly. Jack paused. It was the first time she had offered him her name. He turned back to her, giving a small nod. "Evelyn," he repeated. She nodded, as if she was finally grounding herself, finally reclaiming something they had tried to take from her. Jack looked at Titan, the Pitbull still sitting faithfully beside her. The dog met his gaze, as if waiting for Jack to make a decision. And in that moment, Jack knew there was no walking away from this. Nova had taken everything from this girl. They weren't going to take her again. Jack moved toward the front door, double-checking the locks before glancing out the window into the darkness beyond. Whoever had left her out in the storm had hoped she wouldn't survive. They had underestimated her. And now they would have to go through him. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed down on the cabin like a heavy shroud. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind had died, leaving behind a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jack knew what that meant. Trouble was coming. He sat at the kitchen table, gun in hand, methodically checking the magazine. His body moved on instinct, years of training buried deep in his muscle memory. Across the room, Evelyn sat, curled in the corner of the couch, her arms wrapped around Titan's thick neck. The dog was motionless, but his ears were up, alert. He sensed it, too. Jack glanced at the clock. 2:14 a.m. They were taking their time. Jack had expected Nova to act fast. They had spent too much effort chasing Evelyn to just let her slip through their fingers. The men in the SUV that morning hadn't been scouts. They had been warning shots. And now, the real storm was about to hit. A soft rustling outside made Jack's grip tighten on the gun. Not the wind, something else. Jack rose to his feet, moving toward the window with the quiet precision of a man who had spent years avoiding death. He pulled back the curtain an inch, just enough to see beyond the porch. Nothing. Then, a glint of movement near the tree line. Jack's pulse steadied, his breath slowing as he counted the shadows shifting between the trees. 3. No, 4. Maybe more. They weren't just watching this time, they were here to take her. Jack turned to Evelyn. "Get in the closet," he said quietly. She looked up, eyes wide with fear. "What?" "Now." His tone left no room for argument. Evelyn hesitated only for a second before obeying. She scrambled off the couch, Titan rising beside her, his stance rigid. But the dog didn't follow her. He was staying with Jack. Jack didn't have time to argue. He ushered Evelyn into the small closet beside the fireplace, pressing a finger to his lips before closing the door. The lock clicked softly into place. Then he turned back to Titan. "Ready?" Titan didn't move, but his muscles coiled, his eyes locked on the front door. They didn't have to wait long. The first explosion of sound came from the back of the cabin. A door kicked in, wood splintering. Jack moved fast, pressing himself against the wall just as the front door crashed open. A figure in black stormed in, gun raised, sweeping the room. Jack struck first. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply until the gun clattered to the floor. Before the attacker could react, Jack drove an elbow into his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Titan took care of the rest. With a deep, guttural snarl, the Pitbull lunged, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The attacker screamed, trying to shake the dog off, but Titan held firm, his growl vibrating through the room. Jack didn't have time to watch. More footsteps. Another shadow moved in the hallway. Jack dove for the fallen gun, rolling just as a second attacker fired. The bullet lodged into the wooden beam beside him, missing by inches. He fired back. One shot, straight to the knee. The man collapsed with a strangled cry, dropping his weapon. Titan let go of the first man and turned to the second, standing between Jack and the fallen attacker. The dog bared his teeth, a silent warning. A third man entered through the broken back door, moving fast, weapon aimed. Jack grabbed the kitchen chair and hurled it into his path. The man stumbled, just enough for Jack to close the distance. He slammed his fist into the attacker's throat, cutting off any chance of a scream before driving him backward into the counter. Titan was on the first attacker again, knocking him to the ground. A gunshot rang out. Jack felt the searing pain slice through his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. The fourth man stood in the doorway, gun still smoking. His face twisted with frustration as he raised the weapon again, aiming for Jack's head. Then, Titan launched himself at the gunman. The Pitbull crashed into him with enough force to send both of them to the ground. The gun went off again, the bullet punching a hole in the ceiling. Titan didn't hesitate. His jaws found the man's wrist, crunching down until the gun dropped. Jack turned just in time to see another figure stepping through the broken front door. This one didn't fire. Instead, he shouted, "Take the girl! She's the key!" Jack's blood ran cold. They knew. They knew Evelyn was here. Jack moved fast, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder. He grabbed the closest gun, firing twice toward the doorway, forcing the newcomers to duck. Then he sprinted toward the closet. He yanked the door open. Evelyn was pressed against the back wall, eyes wide with terror. Jack grabbed her hand. "We're leaving, now!" Titan backed toward them, his fur bristling, eyes still locked on the remaining attackers. Jack didn't waste another second. He pulled Evelyn through the back hallway, ignoring the bodies on the floor. Titan followed, his paws thudding against the wooden floor as Jack kicked open the rear exit. Cold air hit them as they burst into the night. Jack didn't stop running. He lifted Evelyn into his arms, carrying her as he bolted for the tree line. Titan was right behind them. The sounds of shouting and gunfire faded as they plunged into the darkness of the forest. Jack didn't look back. He knew one thing. This wasn't over. And now, they weren't just running. They were at war. The world outside had grown quiet again. The danger had passed, at least for now. The storm of bullets and blood was behind them, but the echoes of it still lingered in Jack's mind. In the days that followed their escape, he found himself watching Evelyn closely, waiting for the moment when fear would break her, when she would withdraw into herself and disappear the way he had seen so many others do before. But she never did. She was quiet, yes, but not broken. If anything, she seemed stronger now, more certain of herself. She no longer flinched at sudden noises, no longer tensed when the wind rustled through the trees at night. She was adjusting, adapting. And somehow, so was he. Jack had spent years convincing himself that he was meant to be alone, that solitude was the only way to keep the ghosts at bay. He had built a life in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dogs who didn't ask for anything except food and loyalty. Then this girl had fallen into his world, carrying the weight of a past darker than most adults could endure. And he had told himself from the very beginning that he would get her to safety. That was all. Yet every time he thought about handing her off to someone else, somewhere safer, quieter, far from the reach of the people hunting her, something held him back. Or maybe someone. Titan never left her side. The big Pitbull, once the fiercest protector Jack had ever known, had chosen Evelyn as his own. He watched over her like a sentry, his movements careful, calculated. At night, when Jack woke from old nightmares, he would hear Titan shift from his spot near the door, padding softly across the cabin to check on the girl sleeping soundly in the bed Jack had given her. It was a strange thing, watching them together. A war dog and a child, both survivors. And maybe that was the moment Jack realized. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. She was his. It happened one quiet afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the porch as Evelyn sat cross-legged on the wooden steps, Titan's head resting in her lap. Jack stood nearby, repairing a loose board on the railing, when she suddenly spoke. "Dad?" Jack froze, his grip tightening around the hammer in his hand. The word had slipped out so naturally, so effortlessly, that for a moment, he thought he had imagined it. Evelyn didn't seem to notice his hesitation. She was staring at the small photograph in her hands, an old, weathered picture of her mother. Next to it, she placed another photo. It was a picture Jack hadn't even realized she had taken. A simple shot of the three of them, Jack, Titan, and Evelyn, sitting around the cabin's fireplace on a cold evening. Titan's head was resting against her shoulder, Jack staring at the fire, lost in thought. She set the two photos side by side, then looked up at him. "You're not replacing her," Evelyn said softly. "But I think she'd be happy if I had a family again." Jack felt something tighten in his chest. A lump formed in his throat, one he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Evelyn smiled, running a hand through Titan's fur. The dog let out a deep sigh, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden steps. A long silence stretched between them before Evelyn spoke again, this time more hesitantly. "Can I pick my last name?" she asked. Jack turned, leaning against the railing, studying her carefully. "You can." She exhaled, glancing down at the photos one more time before lifting her gaze back to him. "Then I want to be Evelyn Reynolds." Jack blinked. He hadn't expected the weight of those words to hit him the way they did. She wasn't just staying. She was choosing him. Evelyn grinned. "Because now I have a dad. And an awesome dog." Titan, as if understanding, lifted his head, his ears perking up as his tail wagged furiously. Jack let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah," he murmured. "I guess you do." For the first time in a long time, Jack felt something settle in his chest, something he had thought was lost to him. Peace, a family, and maybe, just maybe, a future. This story isn't just about survival, it's about finding family in the most unexpected places. Jack, a man who once believed he was destined to be alone, found purpose in protecting Evelyn. Evelyn, a girl who lost everything, found not just safety, but love. And Titan, a once abandoned warrior, became the guardian that held them together. Family isn't always blood. It's the people and the loyal souls that choose to stand by you when the world turns its back. In the end, they didn't just escape the past. They built a future, together. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.